Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. My guest this week is Emma Henderson. Emma has had an amazing career in terms of what she's achieved as a captain with Easyjet, working up through the airline. Interesting backstory to get her to that point where she went into the airline industry as a start, and then the challenges she faced as she went through that command process. And we talk all about that. But also then during COVID, she founded Project Wingman, which was the most amazing thing to support National Health Service staff in hospitals with a kind of respite lounge system, which the aircrew provided because obviously they weren't flying, they weren't able to do anything. And that, again, she talks extensively about. It was an incredible story as to what she achieved. These days, she's a motivational speaker, she's a published author, she's just doing some great stuff. So I think you'll find it a really, really interesting conversation by a very, very talented lady who was an absolute pleasure to talk to. And off we go. Emma, fantastic to see you and to have you on the show. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining. Really looking forward to what I think is going to be a lot of fun. I always love talking about flying with other pilots, and there's plenty of that to be talked about, but a whole range of other ththings as well. So it'll be an exciting episode, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. And just to get us started, I kind of always do this. I just give us a resume really of what's been an amazing career. I mean, you've done so many things that I think are really interesting to talk about in what you've done with Easyjet, being a captain with Easyjet in a world where actually there still, and we'll definitely talk about this, there's still obviously quite a disparity between the number of men and the number of women in that profession. And and then what you've done with your Project Wingman thing during COVID was just amazing. I mean, that's a fantastic bit. And then there's a whole range of stuff after that as well. So, that's what I say. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of been a bit of a wiggly road as well, which I quite often sort of talk to kids about because, my plan to be a pilot, I started in the 1980s. When everything we knew about the world was in a book, about that thick, called the Encyclopedia of Everything, and it went from cavemen to spaceflight. And if you wanted to find out information, you had to use microfiche at the library. And I didn't even know there was an air cadets in my hometown till I started doing talks about my career. So, I ended up going off to university to be a lawyer, discovered the University Air Squadron, decided I was going to be a Harrier pilot, got married instead, and didn't think I'd fly again until we were posted to New Zealand, where I came back as a fully qualified commercial pilot. And then Easyjet happened, and then COVID happened, which kind of gave rise to Project Wingman. But even, my Easyjet career was peppered with challenges because I had a serious illness partway through my career and failed my first attempt at becoming a captain. So, it hasn't always been the success that you might sort of think.
Yeah, fascinating. I think everybody has highs and lows, don't they? And I think we'll talk about specifically about highs and lows in a while, but that wiggly road analogy is a really good one because it's so true for pretty much everybody. I don't think there's anybody I've ever spoken to on the podcast or indeed more widely who's not had bumps in the road. It's impossible not to do that, both personally and professionally. So I have to say, though, speaking as a Jaguar pilot, you did well to avoid being a Harrier pilot.
I knew that. I knew that would wind you up.
there's always plenty of rivalry in between the Harrier and the Jaguar force. Some of my good friends are Harrier pilots, but
well, that was purely based on the fact that I was given brown Harrier pilot boots because my feet were too small they didn't have my size in the normal black flying boots. So I thought, right, that's a sign. That's what I'm going to be. But actually, 11 days after I graduated from university, I got married to the Air Force. So.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, we'll come back and talk probably about that as well. Because, I mean, that must be an interesting thing to be. You're in the when you get into the airline world, and then your other half's in the Air Force. I mean, there's some tension there, isn't there, in terms of being in the same right places at the right time and making that all work. I mean, that must have been a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely with children as well, because our children went to boarding school because ultimately we had one parent that deployed to war zones and another parent that got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and went to Malaga. So, arguably the Malaga bit was slightly more dodgy than
On
but
occasion, I'm sure. Yeah.
well, yeah, but I mean, they're definitely there. There was one weekend when I had pre-warned my boss that my husband was on standby for, I think it was Libya, and I said, "But don't worry, he's not going to go. It's, I just, you need to know." And I literally had to phone him up one day and say, "I'm really sorry, I won't be at work this weekend. I'm taking my children back to school because both sets of parents were away. He'd deployed, and they needed me to take them back to school. I couldn't just stick them on a train and say, see you at Christmas, So." Yeah, there's always juggling, isn't there? And I think whether you've got children or not, when you've got two people who have careers, which a lot of us do now, the Air Force hasn't really kind of got its head around the idea that spouses have careers rather than jobs that can just move around. So there can be some challenges there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because my reflection, I mean, obviously, I joined the Air Force in 1980. So, and at that stage, when I went out to the front line in Germany, a lot of all, well, pretty much all the command jobs in places were all married and accompanied, and it was a very male-dominated service. So that pretty much always meant that wives were, if they worked, they were in kind of pin money jobs that they could move around and transfer relatively easily, and didn't have serious careers, and they had to follow their husbands because
Yeah,
otherwise they didn't get the job. And of course, a lot of that has changed. I mean, thank goodness. I mean, by the time I became a station commander, I was actually single at that point. So, I wouldn't have got the job if it was the old rules. So, I was very pleased that they had changed that. But also, I saw a lot of my senior team who, exactly as you described, they were both working in some instances, actually. By that stage, obviously, it was a bit more, it was still clearly a bit imbalanced in terms of male female, but there were a lot more women in a lot of big jobs as well in the service. So sometimes it was the man that was out in another, doing a different job and with a serious career to hold down. But a lot of the time, it was still the wife that was doing that. And then, of course, you
yeah,
introduce same-sex relationships, and we, thank goodness, legalized it, and ended up turning around and fully making that fully equal in terms of housing and all the rest of it. So it has changed, but I think that the obvious challenge is still there, that you're looking for people to be mobile in what they do and move around the country, in particularly for a lot of bits of the military generally, not just the Air Force.
yeah. Which of course I was, being working for an airline. I mean, I was London based, but I was able to move kind of when I first started, I was at Stansted, but when my husband was posted to High Wycombe, then I was able to move to Luton, and then he went to Northwood, and Luton meant I was only, 20 minutes from home, which was brilliant. It's the only time I didn't have a big commute in my career, because when I was at Stansted, we were in Aylesbury, and it was like an hour 10 drive to work and an hour 10 back every day. Which is not that big a commute for some people. People commute longer than that into London, but it is when you're then doing a 12-hour day on top of it.
Yeah. No, it's wearing, and I did a weekly commuting a couple of times in my Air Force career, and I found that very tedious. Whereas away all week, just back at the weekend and stuff, I didn't enjoy that.
Although, as somebody whose husband has deployed a lot and now doesn't, I found that we get on a lot better when I'm away quite a lot. So I think there's something to that.
Yeah. I actually was prepping for this. I was watching a couple of your talks that you've got on your LinkedIn profile and things. I was hugely amused by the comment about I wear estrogen patches to keep my husband alive. I
Oh
thought
yeah. That's not even a joke. That's like just when I call contact the doctors and ask for more, they say, "What's the reason for you needing this medication?" I'm like, "So I don't murder my husband."
Yeah, I think the that's another set of life's challenges that come along, isn't it? At an obvious points in as you get older. Let's go backwards though a bit before we jump. We're jumping all over the place a bit at the minute, and go back to early motivations. What I mean, you sort of touched on, wanting to be a pilot. What kind of took you into that road? What's your kind of earliest thoughts around where you wanted to go career wise and why?
I wanted to fly, but I wanted to be a bird initially because we used to come up. I live in the north of Scotland, and we used to come up here on holiday every year. And my parents would take us to places like the Osprey Centre in Boat of Garton. And I became a young ornithologist there. I was just fascinated by birds and things that flew because my mum was a teacher. She'd take us to interesting museums, in the holidays and things. And it was always the Science Museum and flight that really sort of captured my imagination. But actually, when I was 10 in 1983, I saw the space shuttle land at Stansted, along with 200,000 other people from the southeast of England. And that inspired me. I actually wanted to be an astronaut, but I thought you had to be American and a man to be an astronaut. So I didn't know how to do any of that. So it was kind of the flying bug that I had. And I had a flying lesson for my 18th birthday, after which I said to my dad, that's it, this is what I need to do. And he said, great, how are you going to pay for it? So, that there might have been, if I'd have been really insistent, he well have been able to pay for it for me. But my parents were very much, you need to learn to make your own way in the world. We're not going to just bankroll you, which I think was a really good way to be. And so actually, I went off to university to be a lawyer because I didn't know how to learn how to fly. I didn't know how to fund the flying. And it was walking through Freshers Week that I discovered the University Air Squadron, signed up for that. And it was a time, it was the early 90s when they had just allowed, like Mandy Hickson had just been allowed to fly on the front line as a girl pilot, because flying aircraft Spitfires around the country during the war, wasn't enough. But it took a little while for the Air Force to realise that actually women weren't a threat on the front line. And I think they I like to think I got there on merit, but I think it helped the fact that they wanted to increase diversity on the University Air Squadrons. So there I was at the right place at the right time, and I actually withdrew my application the next day. I thought, oh, I can't do that. That's far too serious for me. And they came round to my house and said, please keep your application in. So I did, and spent the next couple of years flying bulldogs round the skies of South Yorkshire, much to the terror, I expect, of the local residents.
We've all been there. I think when you're carving your initial furrow, I did a flying scholarship in the Air Cadets and at Leicester Aero Club, and yeah, so I had literally had did the PPL before I had a driving license thing, which was hilarious.
Amazing, yeah.
But yeah, I didn't go to university. I missed that bit and just jumped straight into the Air Force. But yeah, and I look back in the kind of early days, and you think, yes, definitely, it was. You should have a no time out for just getting airborne some of the time with some of the stuff we did. But
Oh, definitely. And there's definitely stories from those days that people remember not let's not call it getting lost, but the whole
temporarily
temporarily
uncertain.
unaware of my
Yeah,
position. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. And they were really halcyon days though, because if you look, I had no responsibilities. I was allowed to fly these aircraft around Yorkshire that I wasn't paying to fly. The beer was cheap. It was they were good halcyon times really, and we had a lot of fun, and there was no social media to catch us. So, we had loads of fun doing things that are now committed to memory, and I'm sure the stories have got better because, they're now 30 years old and we've embellished them a bit.
Inevitably, yeah, and it's also with the hindsight spectacles. You always look back on the good bits, don't you? You forget about the bits that are a bit more challenging most of the time. But certainly,
Yeah.
my journey through flying training was definitely challenging when I did it. But you mentioned at the beginning you went because you had a sort of hiatus then, and then went out to New Zealand a bit. So talk about that journey and getting then into the commercial flying world.
Well, yeah, so I did about 70 odd hours on the University Air Squadron. I actually went for aptitude tests at Cranwell. I decided I was going to join the Air Force, and I got marginal for pilot and exceptional for navigator in aptitude tests, and I didn't want to be a navigator. And I had met by then Jim, who I like to describe him as my first husband. He is still my husband, but but I like to describe him as that.
Yeah, keep him honest. Yeah.
Keep him on his toes. Yeah, he used to describe me as his pension plan, but then I left EasyJet, so now I'm just this sort of burden around his neck. But I met him, and we 6 months after we met, we got engaged, and basically 11 days after I graduated from university, we got married, and he was posted to Kinloss up here in the north of Scotland, and so I just decided I wasn't going to join the Air Force. I didn't want to be a navigator anyway. I didn't want to spend the first 3 years of my career away from him, having just got married. I didn't see the point of that. And I then had a BA cadetship that I was accepted onto down in Prestwick, and I didn't even do that because it was 4 hours away and it was just too far. And, I had started my new life. and I didn't know what I was going to be next. And I worked for farmers and I worked in call centers and I worked as a secretary. And eventually we just decided to have children. So I was only 24 when our first child was born. And then over the next 4 years, we had two more children and built a house and decided to stay here in the north of Scotland. And a year after we moved into this house, the Air Force said, wouldn't it be great if you went and lived in New Zealand for 3.5 years? So we did. So we sort of, upped and left and kept the house. But while we were away, it was really my husband. I was a heavy smoker, and he said, if you stop smoking, the money you spend in pounds on smoking will pay in dollars for you to do your PPL if you want to fly again. So I said, brilliant. But I said, you need to understand if I start flying again, I'm not going to stop at PPL. I'm going to want to take that all the way. So he basically backed that. We remortgaged the house, and I came back 3.5 years later with a New Zealand commercial pilot's license, multi-engine instrument rating, and doing the Bristol Ground School ground air transport exams. So, it was kind of a complete curveball in terms of what we had imagined would happen in New Zealand. But what an amazing thing to have come back from a posting, not only having done that, but also the obvious health benefit of not smoking. And I actually took up mini triathlons as a way of, not getting fat as a result of not smoking. So it just was a massive life
Total,
changer.
yeah, I gotta say, total lifestyle change. That's amazing, and and actually to be so productive during an exchange tour out there was, yeah, that's terrific. And I guess New Zealand wasn't bad either. I'm imagining.
It was amazing, and we were told that there was a fast exchange that had been 2 years that we replaced, and our tour was 3.5 years, and we were told you've got 104 weekends, make the most of every single one of them, and we did. And we said to school, we will sometimes take our children out of school to take them traveling around New Zealand. And they said, fill your boots because they're going to learn so much more about going to stand on the thin earth crust in Rotorua than they will learning it from a book. And they were only like 20 months, 3 and 5 when we went over there anyway, and 5, 7, and 8 when they came back. So, it wasn't like they were missing stuff. They don't seem to have been terribly damaged from the time that they spent there.
No, I completely agree with that. Makes all sorts of sense. I mean, interestingly, actually, when I commanded my Jaguar squadron, we had a New Zealand exchange officer on there, and that was the end of the New Zealand fast jet time. So it must have been very much similar,
Well,
similar time
that would
frame.
have been when yeah, because that was Skyhawks, wasn't it? So
Yeah,
that we went out in
yeah,
2003.
yeah.
So
That figures exactly because I was commanding Sixth Squadron 99 to 2002, and so yeah, that's precisely when. Real
well,
shame. I mean,
having
they did that, but
up sticks and taken our family halfway around the world, we arrived in New Zealand and they said, "What's your business here?" And when my husband said Royal Air Force Exchange, they because the Skyhawk had very publicly been disbanded, the customs officers were all saying, do we still have an Air Force? And we were thinking, well, I hope so, because we've literally just left everyone we know behind and come here to work for the Air Force. So
yeah, that is literally the other side of the world as well, isn't it? It couldn't be much further away.
no, absolutely. So it was a game changer, definitely. And then I came back here, and there were no jobs in 2006, 2007. And I applied to all the airlines, and the only one that wrote back to me was GB Airways, who I've still got the letter because it was on lovely headed notepaper with a Union Jack on it. And they said, thank you very much for your letter. We're not hiring at the moment. And just not long after that, EasyJet absorbed GB. And but I was very lucky because I got a scholarship from what was then the Guild of Air Pilots and Air Navigators, which is now the
Hmm.
Honourable Company, and I got the Diamond Jubilee Scholarship to become an instructor. So, which was fantastic because I then did that for 3 years while I was waiting for an airline job, and starting off at High Wycombe, then ending up here, first at Kinloss, then Inverness, and then literally right place at the right time because EasyJet then said they were going to take 12 already qualified commercial pilots onto a type rating, and I was one of them. So I was really lucky to be one of them, and met some fantastic people because we were not ab initio cadets. So some of them had come from other airlines. A few of us had come from instructing, and that was that was the new kind of plan. But partway through the type rating, EasyJet turned around and said, we haven't got enough instructors to get you through the rest of the training. So you can finish the type rating and then go away. And then we'll let you know when you can come back. So even that wasn't straightforward.
Yeah.
When you've got the logistics again of who's going to look after the children, what sort of childcare do we need in place, where am I going to be based, all of that sort of thing.
Well, and it's the uncertainty element, isn't it? That must be quite difficult if because you're never quite sure. Does that actually mean you are going to call me back, or is the yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. You end up in
yeah.
a hold pool. And I mean, at the moment, the chances are you would be, but anything can come along. And it did, because when I did then go back a year later, while I was doing the line training, which for those who don't fly is the bit of flying where you actually you're flying an aircraft with passengers on it rather than in the simulator. You have to train into that role. That's when the Icelandic volcano erupted
Hmm.
and we were all grounded. And I thought, well, I'm last in, I'll be first out. That's it. It's finished before it started. So there were so many times when my career kind of stalled a bit.
Yeah, and what about the actual when you got into it? Was it all you hoped it was going to be in terms of the airline side and commercial aviation?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything. And if I could be based, if they would open a base at Inverness and let me work the hours I wanted to, I'd go back to it now. It's just, I didn't even mind at the time when I was younger. I was quite happy to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go to work. I loved it so much. And for me, it was always that bit where I'd just taken an aircraft into the air, whether I was captain or first officer, and I would literally be thinking, I can't believe that I'm not having to pay to do this. I can't believe someone else is paying me to do this. It is so much fun.
Yeah,
And
it's
it's a
funny.
massive learning curve. Of course it was. But I think that's probably what made it fun because I had a lot to think about all the time and there was always something to find out about.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating you say that because I mean, I have exactly the same thought about a lot of the time I've been flying.
Yeah.
And I've been very lucky. I've flown some, done some amazing jobs with some really interesting aeroplanes and flown on the Battle Memorial flight and things like that. And I can certainly remember that with particularly the Spitfires and Hurricane stuff. I think
Yeah.
this is ridiculous. They're paying me to do this, and it was whereas lots of paying punters pay a lot of money to go in the back
Yeah,
seat with people
absolutely.
on the two-seat ones. Yeah, yeah, absolutely extraordinary. And I mean, we'll undoubtedly look back to that in a minute. But I'm interested in your journey as well, because obviously the podcast focuses on leadership. So your journey through the airline in terms of moving from first officer into the left hand seat, and talk about that a little bit. But then also the kind of leadership elements of that. I'm really interested in. Maybe we'll come back with a sort of subsequent question on that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I do now is work with cadets going into the airlines, and I always explain to them that you are not ever employed as a first officer, you're employed as a future captain. So you are learning leadership skills from the minute you set foot in the simulator, really, because you're having to make decisions. Actually, if something happens to the captain, you are the captain, you're the one that has to make the decisions.
Hmm.
So you have to learn, all the what we used to call soft skills, all the sort of teamwork, workload management, decision making, all of those sorts of crew cooperation, communication, all of those things are things that you almost have to be good at from day one, but you're definitely learning all the time how to make that better. And you're watching really somebody sitting in the left-hand seat so that you're learning from them. You're learning your craft from the minute you get into that right-hand seat of a jet. And I remember going when I went for my one of my command assessment flights, being told, find three people who you love flying with and work out why, and then three people you really hate flying with and work out why, and take on the characteristics of the ones that you love flying with. And I think that's quite a good sort of mantra for leadership in general, actually. Three people you love working with. What is it about them? We all operate the aircraft in exactly the same way. We work with standard operating procedures, obviously. So the actual and the physics of the aircraft don't change. So actually, what is it about the dynamic that comes to the table when you've got different personalities there? And it's always about how the captain leads. So, you have to work out how you're going to lead as a captain. So you're just practicing really. Of course, you're learning your way around the aircraft, but I very much saw it as practicing for the day when I would be the one that was in charge and making sure that when I led my team, it was going to be done in a certain way. and that my team were always going to be looked after in a certain way. My team were always going to be able to trust me and knew that I had their backs. And that starts before you get to the briefing room because it starts with how you show up at work in the morning, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely. And interesting, your analogy about three people you like, three people you don't like. When I very similar thing, I talk about it quite regularly. With I have a sort of metaphorical jar of things I like and jar of things I don't like, and I've built my leadership style over 4.5 decades or whatever it is now on exactly that basis, where I'm looking at people that I think, yeah, that's a really great thing, I like that, I'm going to pinch that idea and I'll do it myself, or other things where I go, no, I'm never ever going to do that again, and I'm never going to allow anybody that works with me to do that. And
Yeah.
because I think that's right. I mean, you have to develop yourself in some kind of mode, and take on those good traits, because that's what ultimately makes you a better leader for sure.
Well, definitely. And we had a lot of fun as well. I think that I always, laughter and humor connects us. It's an emotion that connects us as people. So, and we're allowed to have fun at work as well. So, and we did have a lot of fun in those first days in Stansted. And that helps you to build that connection with people that then helps them to understand why they can trust you and why they would want to follow you. So, fast forward to 2020 when I set up the charity and said, who wants to come and support this? People from Stansted straight away said, well, if that's Emma that's doing that, we trust her. It's about trust, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
Can I
definitely,
trust you to
definitely.
look after me? Can I trust you to, as a passenger, can I trust you to take my family safely to my holiday or wherever? you know, can the company trust me to operate the aircraft and carry the right amount of fuel and make good decisions? So, I think you build that trust. It takes time to build that trust, and you can break it really, really easily.
Yeah, and the other one that directly related to that I talk about a lot is loyalty, because I think that's
Mm,
similarly, that's a very, lots of people look at that as they're expecting people that work for them to be loyal, but it's the other way around as well, in on
definitely.
steroids for me. I mean, I think if I look back to my time, particularly in big command jobs, where you've properly taken one for the team for people, for example, and I've still got them. And there's a case I talk about quite regularly. On when I was on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight one night, we were flying a sortie, and it didn't go very well. The I won't bore you with the whole detail because it's about you, not me. But I think the big boss and at the Air Officer commanding level was very upset about this, wanted to castigate the formation leader, and I said, we can't have him. You can have me. I was the authorizer. I'm the senior supervisor. I didn't actually see what went wrong. I was sitting in line astern, for a fly past, and was looking at the bottom of the aeroplane, so I had no prospect of knowing what had gone on. But I then basically did exactly that. I took the full, very unpleasant video conference the next day, and the guy that was the leader has never forgotten about that. He still
Yeah.
talks about it, and of course that spreads. That kind of stuff spreads through the team very, very quickly. And I think if I say a lot to people, I try and train a little bit on leadership stuff, that time invested in doing that sort of thing will be repaid massively over time.
Oh, definitely. And when I failed command, one of the reasons I talk about it so much is because we don't talk about failure enough and why it's okay to fail at things. But actually, I had a choice after that. So I could have put together, if I'd wanted to, I could have found ways to put a case together against the company to explain all the ways why it was unfair what had happened. Or I could take ownership of it because ultimately it was still me that failed the command. And that's what I did. And I think that it gains you a respect that you can't buy, but when you stand up and say, look, absolutely, this was my fault. How am I going to be better next time? Rather than sort of saying, oh, well, the company should have done this or the company shouldn't have done that. I should have been better. I should have known how to do the things that I didn't do well. So, and I think that's really important to, and you do see it all the time where companies don't appreciate that in their employees, whether it's the military or whether it's a bank or whether it's a supermarket or whatever. You see all the time people who are stepping up out of loyalty to whoever they're working for, and they don't get acknowledged for it. They don't even get thanked for it. And you think, why are you not doing that?
Mm.
Why, as a leader in a business, why would you not make sure you recognize the people that are at the coalface ultimately doing making you money, doing the job you've asked them to do?
Yeah, totally right. And I, again, one of the other things I say a lot is we just don't, the two most underutilized words in the English language in the same sentence are thank and you,
Yeah,
because I think, and it's also not just about the kind of generic email that you send out to people that says, oh, well done, team, you did a great job. It's actually about the taking the trouble to recognize the individuals, and there will always be some that went above and beyond, who you ring up, or you go and sit by the side of the desk and have a conversation with them, or you send them a little handwritten note, or you do anything like that that is a bit more personal and a bit more,
yeah.
it's you've taken the trouble to do it, rather than actually it just being something that kind of feels like it was a duty that you had to tick off. And I think that makes a huge difference to
It really
people.
does. And I always remember in about the January after I left EasyJet, a friend of mine called me up who was the base captain at Gatwick at the time. And we chatted for a bit, and she said, "Actually, this isn't a social call. This is a work call." And I thought, "Oh God, what? Okay, how can they tell me off? This many months after I've left." And she said, "Actually, I realised that nobody ever thanked you for the work you did because I left in COVID. I didn't even get a chance to say goodbye because I didn't know my last flight was going to be my last flight." And she said, "I just thought it's never, nobody has ever said thank you for the work you did for the company. So I'm doing that now." And I thought, wow, it was so amazing. I didn't need it. I hadn't sort of thought to myself, how dare they? But it was so lovely to actually
Yeah.
get just that call of thanks from somebody who had just taken the time to do something they didn't have to do. And that's what the charity was. I know we're going to talk about the charity in a bit, but that's what the charity was all about. It's all about doing something you don't have to do sometimes for people you don't know.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Before we do that, let's look back on the leadership thing, because you've mentioned it a couple of times that obviously you failed going through command, and then obviously subsequently succeeded going through command. I'm just interested in, as much as you want to tell me about it, that kind of journey. What went wrong? What did you learn from it? What did you do differently the next time? And how did that kind of influence your leadership style, I suppose, as you got into it, actually into the left hand seat?
Well, I was ready for command. I was the first of my group of my intake to be ready for command just simply because I had more hours. And so I went through the command process very quickly. And or the pre-command process, you have to have three different flights and do a test and have an interview and all the rest of it. And then I started to get sick, and I just tired initially, but I ended up with this. Yeah, the very short version is I ended up with an autoimmune triggered neurological condition that we call jelly legs because its real name is acquired idiopathic demyelinating polyneuropathy. So that's why we
Yeah.
call it jelly legs.
Okay, I can understand the short version.
Exactly. But it basically meant the big muscles in my arms and legs stopped working. And I mean, I was still flying right up until the point that the doctor said, "I want to send you to see a neurologist." And I knew then that she thought I had multiple sclerosis. And that was right at the point where I was about to sort of go into the command process. I was expecting a course later that year. And I called up my boss and said, "I've just lost my medical." And he said, "Right, well, we'll do your command interview first. And then when you come back to work, you'll be straight back into it." And I had to sit there and say to him, "I think it's if I come back to work." I knew that if I had what they thought I had, which wasn't multiple sclerosis, if I did have that, I knew that I would probably end up in a wheelchair. And he was brilliant because he was somebody I learned a lot of leadership skills from, to be honest with you, because he just had this unwavering faith. He said, "Look, you're going to be back. It's going to be when rather than if, and just keep me posted," kind of thing. So he just had that unwavering belief that I would come back to work and that I would go straight back into the command process. And when I came back to EasyJet, I jumped back into it too quickly because I was so desperate to prove that I was still capable of being a captain, and I was so desperate to prove that I was so desperate to prove that I was still an active physical human being that I threw myself into exercise and I threw myself into command far too quickly. And the exercise, the neurologist who treated me said it will take you 3 years to get back to full health from this. And I didn't listen to that. So I just thought, what a load of rubbish. I can jump back on a bike and I can cycle from Waterloo in London to Waterloo in Belgium, 300 miles with no train, no problem. And that didn't help my back. So I didn't prioritize the right things. My eyes were on the goal of becoming a captain. And I wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. So I was actually making bad command decisions. because I had, as a result of all this ridiculous exercise I was doing, I ended up with a bad back and the stress of the command course. Anybody who's ever done anything stressful and has back problems knows that they don't help your back. So I just ignored that. I thought, well, I'll park the back until I've got command because I was so hungry for it. And I slipped 3 discs in the middle of the command course during a sim, which I failed. And then the next day I passed the sim session, but the instructor said to me, "Why are you limping so badly?" And I sort of explained that I had a lot of back pain. He said, "What are you doing on this command course?" And he was absolutely right to question it. And I was like, "Well, I've got to prove that I can do it and all the rest of it." And actually, the next morning I woke up, the decision was taken out of my hands because I woke up the next morning and I couldn't move. And I was back in hospital on drugs to release my back and anti-sickness drugs because they were so strong. So I had to step down from the command course. Everybody moved on without me. Of course they did, the rest of my course. And again, I didn't make a good command decision, which would have been, can you recourse me and put me on another one when my back is better, rather than carrying on. And instead, I decided to carry on and ultimately failed the final sim check, which was a tough failure that I was given to manage in the simulator, but I still should have, I knew what the process was. I should have trusted the process. And I didn't. I just didn't. I don't, to be honest with you now, I look back and I think I don't know what I was actually thinking I could just carry on, with the momentum lost. It was good in some ways because I had real first officers sitting next to me in the aircraft rather than command, potential command candidates. But it just showed that I wasn't ready for it, and so sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning, having, I just landed the simulator in Nice and we'd landed the aircraft and it was working and no one died, but I hadn't followed the procedure correctly. And I'd not followed the procedure so badly. I do want to emphasize in the simulator that I'd got it so badly wrong that I'd had all sorts of warnings and flap over speeds and all the rest of it. And it had just been, if that had been a real flight, it would have been terrifying for anybody watching it on flight data monitoring. So, I mean, I sat in the debrief room and the instructor, and I had been an instructor, so I knew what it was like to give people bad news. And I decided to sort of help him out a little bit by saying, "I know you can't pass me." And he said, "No, I can't. I want to." He said, "I've been thinking of all the ways that I can think of to try and make this work, but I just can't give you a pass." And that was it, game over, really. And that it was horrible. It was the worst, probably one of the worst days of my life because everything that I've worked towards had been sort of driving towards command. It was the accolade that I had worked hard for and always wanted. And I just I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me because when I was back at work in the briefing room, standing around a briefing table with the training captain, that was exactly the same as I would have been if I'd have passed.
Mm.
And when I was put back into the right hand seat, and people would come up and congratulate me and say, "Oh, brilliant, really great to see that you're going through your line training." And I'd be like, "No, they couldn't afford me this year." I just made a joke out of it to ease other people's discomfort, but it was a really, really difficult time. And there was all this kind of speculation from people about, "Oh, well, they'll just recourse you by 6 months and then you'll be back in the sim." And I knew that the process was that I would have to wait a year, but people kept telling me, "Oh no, it'll only be 6 months." And I wanted to believe them, but I knew I couldn't. And in the end, I had to have this awful interview at Luton in my uniform with the training management team. I mean, it was awful for me. It was not, they didn't make it awful. And I just had to sit there and take it and accept it and say to them, "You're absolutely right." And they did make the right decision, ultimately, I think. But I had to, really put some big girl pants on to deal with that because I was being told by people who had my career in their hands that I wasn't good enough. So, but they weren't saying that, that's one of the things I quite often talk about now when it comes to leadership. If you're having a difficult conversation with somebody, telling somebody they're not doing their job well is not the same thing as saying I don't like you and I'm never going to go for a drink with you.
Mm.
We kind of have to separate this idea that if I say something to you about the way you're doing your job, it's not a personal judgment. It's literally, telling you that if you'd have done that job better, or you weren't doing the job that I was paying you to do when that happened.
And I think the other thing that you've brought out very well there is very often it's not a surprise.
No.
I think the amount of times, because I again have these conversations quite regularly with people talking about feedback. Everybody knows it's really easy to give good feedback to people. Fine, if you're doing a brilliant job and you're a fantastic person, all the rest of it, that's easy to do. It's much harder when it's difficult, or feedback for whatever reason. Whether it's personal, professional, career threatening, all those kind of things. But the amount of times in my career where I have had to do that, and actually you almost get this look of relief over the person that you're talking to, because they're going to go, well, at last. I've actually had it with one guy. I said, well, at last somebody's actually said something that I kind of know that's
Yeah.
the reality. Because so often people are trying to kind of obscure it a bit with smoke and mirrors, and we're not going to give you sort of straight out bad news, whereas actually often that's the best way to do it.
A
And
100% it is, because you can deal with that. At least you know then.
yeah.
And I think that uncertainty is really difficult. And actually, all the speculation about how long it was going to be before I'd have another go, it was actually the same boss from Stansted who eventually phoned me up and said, Emma, it's going to be a year. Just accept it and move on. And I just thought, at last, somebody's told me the truth about what's going to happen.
Mm.
It's the same I found the same as well when my husband would deploy, and it would be really difficult. I remember him, I can't remember where he went, but he deployed and said, I'm going away for 2 weeks, can't tell you where I'm going. I'll let you know when I'm coming back. And then 2 weeks became, oh, it'll be another week, another week, another week. And it became 8 weeks in the end. And if I'd have just known in the first place that it was going to be 8 weeks, then I could have managed that much better than oh, well, he might be home next week. He might be home next week. It's always harder to deal with uncertainty, isn't
Oh
it?
yeah, big time. Interestingly, on that, I mean, I remember when I went to Afghanistan in 2008. The I was the commander of Kandahar Airfield. I knew that this was the kind of direction of travel was changing in terms of the length of these appointments, and I was convinced before I even went that it was going to be a 9 month job. And the Air Force was saying, no, it's going to be 6 months. Right at the very top, Chief of the Air Staff was saying, no, it says 6 months tour. And I basically, from the beginning, said to my wife, I'm sure it's going to be 9 months. And of course, that did really help, because guess what? It was 9 months.
Yeah.
And it was much easier to land that message when it became 6 months. Kind of the calendar clicks to 6 months, and it's, well, yeah, there's three to do.
Well, absolutely. And how relevant is that to now? Because one of the things I get asked to speak about a lot, and this is a cheesy term, but like navigating turbulence. And I have actually navigated actual turbulence. So, I can talk about it with some degree of authority, but I've just over the course of my, I suppose, military wife life, I have had to deal with uncertainty all the time, because even if my husband hasn't deployed, when he's been on an active squadron, he could get called out for a search and rescue call out in our early marriage at any point. And you just have to kind of expect the fact that he might not be there for a period of time, so that you can never guarantee going to a wedding together, can you? Or anything like that. So it's just something that becomes your currency.
It is one of those worlds, that's for sure. It's a bit like that. Step back to your command, though. I mean that I completely understand. That must be a seriously big kick in the teeth, as it were. You've worked really hard to achieve it. You've failed it. You've got that kind of, as you've alluded to, the public return. Everyone kind of knows you were in that mix, and then now you're sitting back in the right hand seat again. How did you pick yourself up? Because again, the common thing here is it's not how hard you fall, it's how quickly you pick yourself back up again.
Yeah.
And that's a classic where you clearly did very, very successfully. So that story I'll be really interested in.
Well, I think I had a lot of support from people I knew. I was at Luton by this point. I had a lot of support from people at work who were really kindly honest with me, and who didn't fluff it. what I didn't need was people saying, "Oh, this is so unfair. You should take the company to tribunal," or the rest of it, because I don't believe in doing things like that. And that would have, I think, shown me as being a very different sort of person from who I am. And initially, my response, so the guy who phoned me up, and you might know him actually, Dave Froggatt, he used to be in
Yeah,
the Air
yeah,
Force.
very well.
It
Yeah,
was him
Jaguar
who
pilot.
phoned me up and said, he said, right, the first thing I'm going to say to you is write down my phone number, and call me back tomorrow, because after what I say next, you won't remember anything else. And he was absolutely right, because he said to me, we're putting you back in the right hand seat, blah, blah, blah. And he was just really, I really agreed with his decision, because he wasn't nasty about it. He just said, this is a decision we've made. These are the reasons, and this is what's going to happen next, which to me it made complete sense, even though I didn't like it. And he was absolutely right. The first time I didn't remember anything he'd said after we're putting you back in the right hand seat. So I called him back the next day and he talked me all through it. And initially I thought, that's it. That's a sign that I've been playing at this boys' game for far too long and I need to just stop flying. So that was my initial reaction. And then I thought, oh, well, actually, what I'll do is I'll stop flying for EasyJet. And I actually contacted somebody I knew who worked for Air Tanker. And I thought maybe I could go and do that. That sounds like fun. And then I realized that actually nobody's going to take somebody who's just failed their command. So what I had to, my only choice was to pick myself back up off the floor and go and get on with it. And I think that comes from my grandma, because her husband died when my mum was 2 or 3 of polio, and she was left with a 6-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 6-month-old. And I said to her once, Grandma, how do you do every day? How did you manage when you were in that situation? And she said, well, darling, I didn't really have much choice. I had to just get out of bed every day and keep going, because I had children to look after and a job to go to. And I thought, that's it, isn't it? I could have sat there and felt sorry for myself and told the world what an awful situation I was in. Or I could go, okay, well, I've just got to get on with it. And ultimately, I was still very lucky to have a job that I loved, a company that wanted to employ me. I was earning good money. You know, you have to literally find the things that are good about your situation. And there's always going to be perspective, isn't there?
Mm.
You know, and you always have to find that.
How was the second journey in when you started it again?
The second time was completely different, because I'd massively overstressed about everything the first time. I'd over prepared in the wrong way for things. My decision making model was, I wrote down I drew out on a piece of wallpaper that was so long it would have gone from the top of the ceiling to the floor, which is useless in a flight deck. Whereas the second time round, I was actually much more chilled out about it. And I did the work, I knew the stuff, I did the work, but I just went into it thinking, well, I don't need to know every single pinpoint about every single failure. I just have to know how to manage it. And that's literally what I talk about now with leadership. It's like, when we're dealing with uncertainty, when you're dealing with incomplete information, you just have to have a process to follow that's robust. And of course, the airlines give you a process to follow. And I followed that and I managed to get through the sims and actually found myself enjoying them. And I came out at the other end of the command course, having done the sim sessions and then going onto the line thinking, oh my God, I can actually do this. This is, I've got this. I did know how to do it all along. I just wasn't ready the first time.
Mm.
I jumped back. The normal sort of day-to-day stuff on the aircraft wasn't stuff I didn't have to think about before I went into, all the things that I should have just been automatic. They weren't yet, because I'd had that 6 months off. So, and then when I pulled on to stand on the day when I actually got my command in an aircraft that's registration was ended in Echo Hotel, which was quite nice because that's my initials.
Yeah, nice.
And the training captain who was doing my line check was actually somebody I had known from Stansted, so he knew the journey I'd been on. And when he said, as I pulled on to stand, congratulations, Captain Henderson, I'm really delighted to tell you you've passed. And that was the moment I became a captain, and we were both quite emotional because he knew that it was a hard one kind of thing to happen, and it hadn't come easily to me. And for me, it was just like, I think sometimes when things have been difficult, they do feel a bit more amazing than they would have done. If I'd have just been handed that on a plate, I would have been a very different sort of captain, I think. I probably would have been borderline arrogant, and that's dangerous. So actually, it was a good thing.
I was just about to ask you actually, and you've kind of half answered it. Do you think, therefore, it was a good thing that you went through and failed the first time, and that was actually a positive step with hindsight?
Yeah, it didn't feel like it at the time, but
Mm,
definitely because it taught me to be a bit more humble. I don't think I was not humble in the first place, but definitely, you know, you have to have quite a lot of humility to walk back into that crew room, not having succeeded and just get on with the job, and being willing to accept the help that you've asked for as well. You know, you don't get through these things on your own. Your colleagues, rally around you, and
mm.
everybody was rooting for me, and everybody wanted to help me to understand what had gone wrong. Nobody, nobody laughed, nobody took the mickey, nobody ever, said anything derogatory about the fact I'd failed, because I think everybody who was already a captain knew what the course was like and how it could have been them. And everybody who was a first officer knew that it could just as easily happen to them as well. So it was a very level playing field in that sense. And yeah, definitely it made me have much more respect for the position, I think, than I would have had if I'd have just walked into it. So
Mm.
and it made me lead. It definitely shaped the way I chose to lead my crew. And I had really thought about what sort of captain I was going to be, and and I was able to sort of jump into that straight away, basically. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
that
it was definitely a
doesn't
good thing.
surprise me. Doesn't surprise me. I think that's so often true. I mean, I look at my own kind of many failures along the way, and I think that very often they do make you. It's the classic, isn't it? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
And it is true. Let's talk about leadership styles and traits and things like that then, because you've mentioned that it made you a different captain in terms of the way you did. What do you kind of hold dear in terms of approaches? What kind of leadership did you want to exhibit and successfully exhibit when you were a captain?
Well, I think it would probably be called servant leadership in a lot of ways now. But I wanted to lead from the front, but um, by doing what I said I was going to do all the time. So, I would always, for example, on a night Ibiza, which would be a classic route where we would be likely to get people who were either drunk or on drugs or whatever, or had been all weekend. That's the routes that we would expect bad behavior on. And I always wanted to make it very, very clear to my crew that I had their backs. So if they weren't happy with somebody being on board, I would offload them. I wouldn't make them do that. I would quite happily offload them. And we never had to, but they knew that they knew they had that backup if they needed it. And on during delays, for example, I wouldn't hide in the flight deck. I'd always be out in the cabin, not just sort of showing my face, but I would actually go and take water down to all the passengers, carry the water down the aisle and hand it out with the crew, because it helped them out, but it also helped me to understand the mood of the passengers. So I knew what I had to do to then manage that situation. Making sure that I was always giving people updates when I said I was going to. So it's doing what you say you're going to do, doing the right thing all of the time, even when no one's watching. And making sure that I think that Simon Sinek's book, Leaders Eat Last, it's that kind of mentality that you're leading from the front, but actually you're the last one through the door.
Sure.
So you don't leave anyone behind, and making it was always about people, looking after the people, because the company had its requirements, and the operating procedures determined that we did things in a certain way, but how you treat people is up to you ultimately, isn't it? And it doesn't cost anything to turn up at the briefing table, well, for a start, on time, which is something that is a big bugbear of mine, is when people don't turn up on time for something, and they, especially first officers who, you kind of think you should be definitely here early, um, uh, and when they're consistently late, you think, you don't care about this enough. It
Mm.
just gives an impression of something that might not even be true about them, but it just gives the wrong impression. So
It's also a respect thing, isn't it? I think it's again, I say this quite a lot with some of the training stuff about just in the classroom, for example. If you're not turning up on time, you're you're not showing any respect to the other people you're working with in the classroom. Your fellow
Yeah.
participants. We're waiting. Everyone's waiting for you. I mean, obviously, that's also true for the facilitators, etc. But you need to just think about how your behavior is perceived by others, and it's that sort of emotional intelligence aspect of it as much as anything.
But
I
it
mean,
just says my priority is elsewhere, doesn't it? It just says,
yeah, yeah,
you're not my priority,
right,
which is like, well, actually, when you're in a crew room, when you're in a crew situation, I'd better be your priority because if I die, you're landing the plane.
mm,
So, you kind of have to find a way, you've got to find a way of gelling those people together. And don't forget as well that in a big airport like Gatwick, there's so many crew, you're probably not going to work with the same people every day.
mm.
So you're literally putting a team together every single day that you've never met before to go and do a job that, has 180 people's lives in your hands every time you take a plane into the air. So it really matters the way you show up for people. And I can tell when I travel now what the captain's like as a commander, because you can tell from the way the crew are behaving. So, it's really obvious to me anyway.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I share that view completely, and I've had a couple of other airline guys on the podcast. Actually, the former colleagues of mine, both actually, one was a former flying instructor, who was the Virgin Atlantic pilot for a very long time, Nick Anderson, and then Howard Burton, who was he was BA, relatively recently retired from BA, and they were A340 and 777 respectively, and long haul big airplane type thing, and exactly the same kind of comments, because I think you do face that challenge in all of the airlines. I think that you're not working as a constituted team. Very rarely the flight deck crew know each other. Never mind the everyone down the
Yeah.
back. So you're having to forge that and quite quickly, and leadership really matters. Undoubtedly, really matters in that space.
And you can totally influence that. And that comes back to a bit about what I was saying before about, I talk about the atmosphere. Yeah, you're the atmosphere. The way you show up at the table, that is the atmosphere you bring to the room,
Hmm.
and that filters out around the room. And we've all been in that place, haven't we? Where there's been somebody who's a drain in the corner, and they're just like their mood is kind of filtering out
Yeah.
across the room. But equally, if somebody really positive is in the room because you just kind of, very Star Wars like feel their presence, don't you?
Yeah, no, totally true. And interestingly, another friend of mine who was a former Navy captain was very interesting on this, because he said if he got up in the morning and was just in a bad mood and he allowed that to be visible, then it would permeate through the entire crew of the ship within minutes.
100%.
And that's so
Yeah.
true.
But that's not the same thing, is it, as saying you're not allowed to ever have anything going wrong in your life.
Yeah, of course
You
not.
just have to learn ways of dealing with it so that, and if it's not dealable with on that day, then, slightly different on a ship. But, if it's not dealable with that day, if it's so big that you can't deal with it that day, you can't go to work because
Mm,
it's not about being whether or not you're in a bad mood for the crew. Ultimately, it's about the safety of the aircraft and the job you're there to do.
for
So
sure.
if that
Yeah.
thing is so big, and there will be things that will happen for people where they just have to say, I'm sorry, I can't be at work today. And that big thing might still be there, in a few weeks' time, but you've processed it and you can park it and you can compartmentalize it. And I
Yeah.
think you have to be really good at doing that as an airline captain.
I know, very interesting point. And I think, interestingly, two aspects of that. One is that comes down to you as an individual recognizing that you need to speak up and actually state that, and have the kind of integrity to turn around and say, look, I'm just not good today. I need to take the time out. But also, you need to be in a position where you're working for an organization and leadership above you who are not going to then enact retribution on you for whatever you've done.
Absolutely.
If I look back to Air Force squadrons, for a good example of that, where same thing, you're single seat airplane most of the time that I was flying. So sure, there's no one else involved, but equally the pilot's pretty important in keeping the airplane in the air. And the last thing you wanted was people who were flying who, for whatever reason, felt that they were not, up to it that day. And that could be a medical thing. It could be just an emotional state. It could be something that's gone on in their life that affected them in a particular way. And having the kind of empathy to be able to recognize that this needed management in a slightly different way, and care was really important. And I think it must have been absolutely the same in your world for sure.
Yeah, and it was really interesting when I started at Stansted actually watching these captains that I was flying with and the way they managed flights, and then learning more about them. Stansted was a small enough base that we got to know each other quite well. And there would be people who would be going through things like recent divorces, or they'd be going through one of them had a very poorly child who was under the care of Great Ormond Street, and all sorts of things that would be going on for people. And you'd think, how are you able to do your job and be going through all that? And that's, I think, where I learned a lot about how you kind of separate yourself. You're almost in the car on the way to work. You go from being, and there's a chapter in my book about this actually, where you go from being, for me, Captain Mummy to Captain Emma. You have to sort of leave that behind a little bit and separate yourself from the stuff that's going on at home, because ultimately you're operating a multi-million-dollar machine with people's lives on board into sometimes dodgy weather, or busy airspace or whatever. And you can't, it's not your job to carry those things onto the flight deck with you, so you have to be able to separate yourself from that. And I think that's something that not everyone can do.
No, I think it's very true. And I think interestingly, when I look backwards, there was a great flight safety video that came out in the Air Force years and years ago now, which talked about, particularly in obviously looking at the aviation environment, but focused on everyone else's impact on the aircrew, and the things that, and I've forgotten the name of the film now, it doesn't really matter anyway, but it was really good because what it did was showed how little things that you do to that particular pilot or that crew on a particular day start to have an impact. And it was all sorts of
Yeah.
stupid stuff around the RAF policeman at the gate checking the car pass and his attitude, and the individual in station headquarters talking about some travel claim that had been rejected, and that and a lot of it was just thinking about, is this the right time to be having that conversation with this individual, or making sure that they're in a good space, that you're not basically bursting. We used to talk about the mission bubble, that
Yeah.
essentially, you need to get your head in the right space to be able to operate safely, effectively, and be fully capable of doing what you're doing. And it is so important. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about that, particularly the ones that aren't necessarily at the controls of the airplane, because they just don't have that kind of thought process linked to the impact you can have.
Well, I think that's about the culture in the company as well, isn't it? Because isn't it ultimately about everybody at Easyjet is about the mass transportation of people. So I might have been the pilot, but actually we're all about putting people into the air and getting them from the A to B. And that's kind of comes back to that lovely NASA story where, the cleaner is asked what they
Yeah,
do at NASA, and he
yeah.
says, I'm putting a man on the moon. If your mission is that clear, that that you're, what the part that you're playing in that mission is still really, really valuable. Surely, yeah, for me, that's the ultimate sort of the ultimate way to have company culture.
So amusing you say that. I use that story all the time.
It's good, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and particularly when I do a lot of work at Deloitte University, for example, and I talk to them about the client-facing side of their business versus the internal services side of their business, and I say, how often do you actually involve the people that are actually the glue that hold the whole organization together in your big celebratory events when you have you've won a big piece of work, or you've just delivered a bit of work or whatever. And the answer is almost never. So, well, you need to think about that. If you're trying to build
Yeah,
build
absolutely.
a team culture that involves the whole team, then that is really important. So no,
And that was actually ultimately what Project Wingman was about, because we didn't know or care really what role people had in a hospital. We just knew that they were welcome into our lounges. In the same way as when you board an aircraft, actually, you could be chief of the air staff or you could be a bin man, and it wouldn't matter to us because you're all equally important.
Mm.
So everybody with speedy boarding, obviously, and in business class thinks they're more important than everyone else on the plane. But I've got news for you. You're not. In an evacuation, we don't care. We're just, our crew are just going to get you off the aircraft.
Yeah, we
And
only
and
care
put
you don't take your bag with you.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and put your phone away. But I think that's why Wingman worked so well, because it was the same mentality. So when we went into hospitals and said, we will welcome you into these lounges. Let us, serve you a cup of tea and listen to you. You could be a consultant anaesthetist, or you could be cleaning the corridor. You could work in the incinerator, and it didn't matter because everybody was in the business of saving people's lives at that time.
Yeah, thank you for the lovely segue. Let's take you back a step on that because I think a lot of people listening or watching this probably are going, "What's Project Wingman?" Because they might never have heard of it. So just wind that back as to the whole the genesis of the concept, what you actually did, and how it then worked. I think that because it is a terrific story.
Well, it starts really in 2019 when I was asked to be in an ITV documentary called Inside the Cockpit, which I absolutely loved. Having my own film crew for 6 months, I realised that I'm one of those people that just likes to be in the limelight. And but actually, I didn't realise that that was going to give me a platform I would need a year later because it came out in 2019. I went viral on TikTok, on Twitter, which my children thought was absolutely shameful. And um, that was really, really useful because it meant that, we went into 2020 in the aviation industry, literally riding a crest of a wave. We thought like 2020 was going to be the best year ever for aviation. And then obviously, from about November, December onwards, we were getting these reports of a virus in China and it was spreading. And I operated my last flight in March, on March the 16th, 2020. I operated back into Gatwick from Luxembourg with only about a third of our load of passengers. And they all got off saying good luck instead of goodbye. And I don't know how, but I knew coming into Gatwick that night. And I can vividly remember flying down the approach and thinking, this is going to be really bad. And when I turned away from my aircraft that night, when I sort of walked away and sort of checked I hadn't left the lights on, I didn't realise that that was the last time I would ever operate a commercial flight, possibly even fly again, other than as a passenger. And I got home, I was a peer support mentor for my airline. And I got home and had a chat with the clinical psychologist who was overseeing that peer support program, which all the airlines have. And he said, there's a guy at BA who's thinking along the same lines. You should have a chat. So we called each other the next day. His name's Dave Fielding, and we had a chat, and we were both thinking sort of exactly the same way. And he had an in to the NHS because his girlfriend worked for a hospital, and I had this platform where I was Captain Emma, so everybody in Easyjet knew who I was, but actually people in other airlines knew who I was as well because they'd all watched Inside the Cockpit. So I just put messages out on social media. We decided we were going to just provide tea and empathy to NHS staff. We realised that there was an opportunity for us to do that. And it was really simple because we could just ask for a room that was big enough to practice social distancing. Because if you remember in the early days of COVID, you couldn't catch it unless you were 2 meters apart. So we asked for that space, and I just hit social media hard and said, if you would like to be involved in this, please send your details to a Gmail account that I set up hastily that was called something ridiculous like NHS Aircrew Response or something. It wasn't a very punchy name at all. And within 3 days, I had 750 people who'd responded. And by the summer of 2020, that number had grown to 6,500 people across the country. And our concept was really simple because we said we'd go into hospitals. It didn't cost the hospital anything. They didn't have to do anything apart from allow us to be there. And we would send uniformed crew into hospitals to literally do the chicken or beef, sir. Would you like a cup of tea? Can we talk? If there's anything you want to talk about, we're here. And we had a bit of a race between the Whittington and the Royal Free as to who was going to be the first person to agree. And once that first 3 weeks after the initial conversation I'd had with Dave, we had our first lounge open in London, and it just went like dominoes after that, spread throughout the whole of London. And he was responsible for London. I was responsible for not London, which was arguably quite a large area. And so, and we basically set up team leaders to manage crews to crew these lounges. Some lounges were crewed 24 hours a day. And Dave left the charity after about 6 weeks or so to go and do something else. But he was instrumental to it being set up. And I ended up finding myself in the position of being CEO of this charity that I'd never run a charity before. I'd never run a business before. And I basically looked to the leadership of Carolyn McCall, who was the CEO of Easyjet for most of my time there. And she came in from The Guardian and she said, I don't know how to run an airline. I know how to run a business. So I'll do the business and I will put people in place around me who will give me the airline advice I need. And I did that. I basically found people who knew how to run charities and things. And it just continued throughout. It peaked in the summer of 2020 with 104 lounges across the UK. We had two in New York, but we had these 6,500 grounded aircrew who were getting, I think I referred to this earlier on, they were getting out of bed every day and doing something they didn't have to do for people they didn't know when they were facing their own massive challenges.
Mm.
And it was life changing for so many people because I mean we served about 200,000 people in the NHS, and we but it was, I think it was the profound effect we had on our own community as well. We established our own support network effectively because if you worked for Wingman, they all called themselves winglets. So if you were, well, once a winglet, always a winglet, and there've been wingman weddings since then and wingman babies, and but I have also met people who've said to me, I just really wanted to tell you that I was about to kill myself. And then I discovered that I could go and volunteer for Project Wingman, and that saved my life because it gave me a sense of purpose.
Wow.
And that's when you realize that all those hours sitting in front of your toilet on your landing, running this thing from Zoom, that's really powerful
Mm.
because it's hard, I think, to see the impact of something from the distance. I didn't leave Murray, which is the county I live in. I didn't leave Murray for about 8 months. So I got to go to one or two hospitals locally, but I didn't see the extent of this at its peak. It was
Mm.
everybody else was doing the work. And, that is mind blowing. And we had other examples where there was a doctor that came into one of our lounges one day and said, do you know when we're going to be flying again? And the response was, no, we've got no idea. And they burst into tears and said, my father died last night. I'm from South Africa. I don't know when I'm going to get home to see my family again. And we couldn't take that pain away from them and we couldn't fix the problem for them. But one of our crew sat down next to them and chatted with them and it was literally tea and empathy because it's sitting down next to people while they go through something so they're not going through it alone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
And that was
hugely
where the
powerful. Hugely
powerful,
powerful.
absolutely, it was so incredible. Not just the sort of concept, it was what was incredible was how many people got out of bed every day and wanted to carry on doing that for as long as they did. And in the summer of 2020, we realized that as hospitals were starting to go back to work and airlines were starting to stand up again, we knew that we were going to have to change our model because it wasn't sustainable with the crew numbers that we had. So we bought a double-decker bus and turned that into a mobile wellbeing lounge, which we launched at Homerton Hospital in February 2021 on the One Show, actually. The BBC One Show got involved, which was amazing. And that was really good publicity for us. So any publicity we could get, we would take. And because, we were an unknown charity in the middle of a financial crisis where everybody needed money.
Mm.
And we managed to raise this £100,000 just, from nowhere
Is
almost.
that
And then we had to
I was
just,
about to ask you about that, donations and stuff. Was that just public donations?
yeah. It was a mixture of public donations to start with, and we did things like the Yorkshire Three Peaks Challenge, and we did a challenge where you could cycle, run, or row, and then you logged how long you'd done that for, and then we mapped how far we'd flown, in terms of miles. So I think we got to Singapore or something, which was quite cool. And we did that was sponsored. We had we encouraged people to do fit and active things because that's obviously good for well-being. And then when we started with the buses, we actually rented them out. So there was a huge amount of money from the Captain Tom Foundation
Mm-hmm.
that was given to NHS charities together, and that was earmarked for wellbeing projects. So we had people approaching us saying, we've got X amount of money to spend. Can you bring a bus to us? And we were like, well, that's great because we didn't make a profit from it, but we did need to cover our costs.
Mm.
So we were able to partially fund it that way as well. And just the support of other companies, we got given because the entertainment industry collapsed, we got given things that made our lounges become sort of first class lounges. So we had flower walls and balloon arches and plants. And one of our founding sponsors, Gold Key Media, gave us £10 million worth of newspapers, magazines, and luxury items that we could give out to people coming into the lounges, which was an incredible gesture from them. They supplied every single one of our lounges with magazines that they replaced every week. So it
Wow.
kept them going, but it actually kept us going as well. Bose gave us 8 sound systems so we could play music in some of the lounges, and we got other systems from other places as well. We were just given a lot of stuff, and that continued until we closed the charity this year, actually, because we were there, and this is a really important thing about leadership, I think. We were there for a specific purpose at a specific time. And the long-term well-being solution for NHS frontline staff can't be volunteer crew in uniform.
Hmm.
We've shown what's possible. And although the need is still there, the way that we service that isn't possible anymore. So for me, good leadership is also knowing when you need to stop
Yeah, I totally
and
agree.
not just going blindly ahead with things all the time. And so we did stop earlier this year, and I'm incredibly proud of the way that that brought the aviation industry together, not just crew, but interestingly, I contacted David Morgan, who was at the time the chief pilot at Easyjet, and said to him, "Can you please give us permission for Easyjet crew to wear uniforms in the lounges?" And he said, "Yeah, not only that, I will also get permission from all the other airlines because they all have a WhatsApp group." So although the airlines all compete with each other, they all rallied together behind the charity because they could see we were described as the only good thing to happen to aviation in 2020. So, they could see the benefit of it. And, crew obviously could as well. And
Oh, very personally rewarding for a lot of the crew that were involved in it, I'm sure. I mean, I think the tough, but at the same time, one of the things that I think, interestingly, I ended up all my training work evaporated overnight when COVID kicked off, and the my wife was having a bit of a minor panic about, well, my God, where are we going to get any money from? And I said, well, look, I'm a crisis management guy. That's what I'd gone into Deloitte doing after I'd left the Air Force. So I think this is the biggest crisis any of us have ever known. So it's probably going to be all
yeah,
right. And
hold
sure
my
enough, it
beer.
was. I ended up in the COVID task force, the cabinet office, and worked really hard. And I think the nice thing for me, and I suspect for an awful lot of, for you personally and for an awful lot of your people, is it did definitely make me think I did have a material contribution at a time when the country really needed that. And that is actually
Definitely.
personally quite rewarding to do that. I mean, it's not, it wasn't about financial gain. It was about actually not feeling useless.
100% that. It was like, having a sense of purpose at a time when the bottom had dropped out of a lot of our worlds,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
obviously the airline industry collapsed, the hospitality industry collapsed, the training industry collapsed. Everybody had to find ways to reinvent themselves, and actually, interestingly, the people that found ways to do things differently are the ones that have been the most successful, aren't they? And if everybody who said, "Well, we've always done it this way, and I'm not changing for anyone," they're the ones who struggled because they weren't fluid in their decision making.
Yeah, you've got to be adaptable and flexible. That's for sure. No, well done you. I mean, I think you also the result was an MBE for you, but as I've heard you talk about, actually, for everyone that was involved, and I think that's that
Yeah.
says a lot about you as well. That you're kind of immediately into that. It's not me, it's the whole team thing, which is true, but not everybody says that.
Well, it is true. Because at the end of the day, I appreciate the fact that if I hadn't have been here in the first place, there wouldn't have been a Project Wingman because there would have been no one running it. But equally, if nobody had signed up to volunteer, I'd have just been sat there talking to myself on Zoom, wouldn't I? So,
Yep.
and I wasn't the one that was getting out of bed every day and going into COVID environments, not knowing what I was going to bring back with me. So, I think that it is a wonderful thing to have had, and it's certainly been, it's been my greatest pleasure to be able to meet people who volunteered for Project Wingman at the time and meet them since and just say thank you to them for the work that they did because, I am the one that's been, highly rewarded for it. But it does belong to all those awards and accolades do belong to the people who actually made it happen.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be wrong to not say that.
No, totally right. I 100% agree with you. I think that equally though, I think a lot of people who were involved in it would recognize that you were the one that started it, and therefore credit to you. Yeah, because it is it's a phenomenal idea, and I think particularly for the NHS at that time. I mean, I know from talking to a lot of them in the work I was doing and with the Cabinet Office side, just how ghastly and traumatic it actually was for everyone in pretty much any hospital, but certainly the frontline staff I think really felt the brunt of that.
Yeah.
And so what you did was fantastic. So yeah, more power to you, and you deserve all the credit you get for it. That's amazing.
Well, thank you. It was a privilege to be able to do it.
No, I'm sure. Yeah, I can completely see that in everything you've said. I mean, I can see behind you a copy of your book. For those watching on video, slightly obscured by the sun shining through
Yeah, it
your
is now.
blinds, and but just talk about the book and the fact that it's a relatively new publication, I believe. And
Uh, well, I published it last year, and I'm really glad I wrote it when I did actually, because I think that if I wrote it now, there's things that I would have forgotten. And really, I wrote it initially as because when I got my MBE, I did a lot of news and press interviews because it gave publicity to the charity. But people kept saying, "Oh, your story is really interesting. You should tell it." So I decided to write it down. I was introduced to an agent who said, "These are the 10 most interesting areas of your story. Give me an essay on each," kind of thing. And we put the book together, and he didn't actually publish the book in the end. My lovely publisher, Rick at Fisher King Publishing, he when I was introduced to him, he read it straight away and went, "We have to publish this. It's going to be great." So um, that was fantastic. But it's really, I mean, I wrote it as my story into, through, and out of aviation and what I did next. But people are reading it as they're taking leadership lessons out of it that were unintentional, really. Things like going above and beyond is in the book, from things that I did throughout my career. It was never just a job for me. It was always, do the job 150%. And actually my life is 150%, which makes me quite hard to be married to. So all power to Jim for 30 years. But it is really the story of a girl from Essex who had no real reason to go into flying other than the fact I enjoyed, I liked the idea of it, and has ended up doing a lot of other things along the way. So the idea really behind it is to show people that actually it doesn't matter it's not a well-being book, and it's not a sort of rainbows book or whatever. It's just my story. It's just a story of you know failing and challenges and sort of working out how you muddle through this mad life together and all the rest of it. And the relevance of the panda that's just come back from Hong Kong is that there are fewer than 500 female airline captains in the world still, and there are 2,000 giant pandas which are endangered. So the
you're rarer than
panda
pandas.
the panda had to come back, but yeah, if you want to order a copy of Grounded, we can probably put a link on the end of on the text of this, but you can get it through my website. You can get it through Amazon as well, but you can get it through my website, and I'll sign it for you.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'll put a link in the show notes. That's absolutely right. I mean, actually, you raised it there because it's the other area I wanted to come back to, because we touched on it at the very beginning. Female aircrew in airlines. And obviously, you mentioned Mandy Hickson. I've done a podcast with Mandy. She and Joe Salter sort of carved the initial ground in the Air Force. But the airlines were also pretty slow into this, weren't they? I mean, it was it was been a long old journey. And I'm just interested in your reflections around that, how that has evolved, whether it's in the right place now, whether it's heading in the right direction, what are the challenges that remain, all that kind of stuff.
So one of the things I think it's really important to remember is that throughout my career, because there are so few female airline pilots, most of the people who've championed my career have been men. And I've never had any kickback from anybody, male or female, about what I was doing in that seat and whether or not I deserved to be there. The only person that's ever put pressure on me to do as well as possible in the sim is me. I've always thought I've needed to be sort of to prove myself almost. I always thought I was going to fail every sim check. I just assumed that that would always be my last sim, and that so I've always had been lucky in that respect. And even starting with my husband, who, my brain just doesn't work in a navigation way a lot of the time. So when I was doing my exams in New Zealand, he would literally sit there and explain things to me in crayon, which I really needed, and that was really helpful. I think it helps as well that I was 36 when I started working for Easyjet. So I was already married with three children at that point, and I could hold my own. And I do know that in aviation, it's not the same for everybody. But that wasn't, my experience was always very positive. People wanted, people love having women in the flight deck. It's always a nice day out. We do our jobs well, but the numbers are low and they haven't moved since the 1980s. So we have to look at why that is. And for me, it's not about aiming for 50-50 men and women in that industry. And it never has been, because actually, not everybody wants to do that as their job. So for me, it's about making sure the opportunity is there for everybody. And that means that we have to make sure that in schools, for example, girls and boys both know that pilots can be women as well.
Mm.
So if the opportunity is there, it still then has to be the right person for the job. And Mandy talked, I think, about, she wrote about in her book about the fact that aptitude tests in the Air Force were designed by men and for men, not to exclude women, but it's just that it used to be men that flew planes all the time.
Mm.
So, things like that can change to make them a little bit, or well, not a little bit, but completely gender neutral. But ultimately, you still have to be able to do the job. And I think that we are seeing much bigger numbers now of women coming through flight training. And EasyJet aimed for 20% by 2020. And they actually got there in 2019, but their big announcement was overshadowed by COVID, sadly. But, 20% of pilots is great. But actually, what happens then in the command process? Why do so few women go for command, or why do so few women get command? I don't think it's not a prejudice thing about gender. The aircraft, as you know, the aircraft doesn't care whether you're a man or a woman or what colour your skin is or anything else. All that matters in an aircraft is, can you fly it?
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be the right person for the job. And I think that we need to focus on that. The danger we have if we try and push for 50-50 women, men in the flight deck is that we disenfranchise all the brilliant men that support us. And that's pretty much, I'd say that's 99% of the male pilot population. There's always going to be that 1% that thinks it's funny to make racist, sexist, misogynist jokes, whatever it is. Those people exist in all walks of life. And it's not okay, but we can't do anything about that. We can do
Mm.
something about the making sure that every child in this country understands there is an opportunity to go and work for an airline as a pilot, join the Air Force, be an engineer, all of those good things. And that's where the sort of STEM work comes into it, that I think we've all got a responsibility to do. That's a collective responsibility as an industry. And the problem with the aviation industry at the moment is we have such a massive skills gap that if we don't address it, there won't be an industry in the future. So, I think we have a collective responsibility to do that. And that's why I put videos on TikTok, and I make sure I'm talking about flying all the time, even though that's not really what I talk about for, it's in my speaker business. It's really important to me that young people understand there's a career there for them in aviation. And I get, because I work with Leading Edge, which is a flight training school. I get people now. I have a course that I've designed and deliver called The Whole Pilot, which is preparing them for their airline careers. And it's hilarious because you get like a 19 or 20-year-old who'll say, "Oh yeah, I watched you on Inside the Cockpit when I was a child." And you think, yeah, thanks for making me feel so old.
Yeah, I can empathize with that. I get that pretty regularly. I turn around and say to people, I joined the Air Force in 1980, and most of the room look at me going, yeah, that's
I
about
wasn't
10
born
years.
then.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. By some margin in many instances as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's when I first realized how old I was when I flew with a crew who were all younger than my youngest child.
Oh, my
And I
God.
thought, that's not great.
Yeah, that's good going. Hey, just a few questions to kind of wrap up because you've been very generous with your time, but there's a few things I really would like to ask you. I mean, I always talk about highs and lows, and we've kind of covered some of that, I guess, in terms of the conversation we've been having anyway. But career high point for you?
Oh, 100% getting command. Absolute, hands down, career high point. Getting command, having failed it, was just uh, the biggest win sort of I could ever have had, really.
Yeah, nice. And what's the low point? I can guess.
Failing command.
That was pretty right if I
Well,
guess.
actually, probably failing command, and the day that I realised I wasn't going back to EasyJet, even though that
Yeah,
was my decision, it was still a loss of identity. I mean, we haven't even touched on this, but realising that I was walking away from something I loved so passionately was hard.
I bet. Yeah. No, and you did sort of allude to that in COVID that you suddenly it was your last trip. We didn't touch on that. I mean, how did that come about? Just was that just because the airline decided to downsize, or was was it your choice, or what was it?
It was my choice. I mean, voluntary redundancy was offered. They basically needed to protect jobs by put everybody went 50%. They offered voluntary redundancy. I'd spent my time up here running the charity and having conversations with my husband about whether or not I wanted to go back. He was shielding. The company wanted me to go back to work, even though they'd said that there was to be an opportunity to go back later if you were shielding somebody. Um, there were all kinds of things that were happening by that point, and ultimately, I just uh, thought to myself, there was a rumor that EasyJet wasn't going to survive financially. And I thought I didn't want to be like the Flybe pilots, and I thought I'd rather leave with something than nothing. And I think my life has moved on. And I thought, well, I can always go back to flying if I want to. But my time to leave had come, and you know, I did wonder who I was going to be if I wasn't Captain Emma. But it turns out I'm exactly the same person. I just don't wear the cheap nylon
Mm.
uniform anymore. So and actually EasyJet will always be my first love when it comes to airlines. I still very much a fan of the company. I I would go back to EasyJet in a heartbeat if they would open a base in Inverness. I keep campaigning for this, that I could go back as base captain if would just open a base in Inverness. They haven't taken me up on it yet, but you
Do you
never know.
you do any flying?
I don't. However, I have just been approached to get my instructor rating back again, because there's also a massive shortage of flying instructors, because kids don't want to do that anymore. They want to go straight to the airlines. So they don't do the traditional route of sort of PPL, CPL, become an instructor, then go flying, a dash or something like that. So I have been asked to do that, and I am considering it, but it's just time.
Uh,
I'm away a lot as it is, and I don't know if I want to go back to pulling little planes out of hangars anymore and having to refuel them myself.
yeah.
I must be honest.
I must admit, I people often ask me the same question, and I don't fly, and
I was wondering that.
I had the opportunity, particularly with historic stuff, post doing the Battle Britain Memorial flight and
Mm.
things like that, and I actually had some very good conversations with people in the Air Force on the BBMF at the time. One guy in particular who gave me some great advice. He said, "Look, you need to think about how much time you've got, whether you're
Yeah,
seriously going to be able to give it enough time to be safe and sensible. If you're doing particularly display flying with those kind of
yeah.
airplanes, you can't just be doing that and that's it. You need to be doing some other flying as well, and it's just too much of a life consumer. So no, I stepped away from it, and added to which for me there was a little bit of uh, there's not much private flying you can do in the UK. Certainly not where I live in the south of England, with all the airspace restrictions and everything else. That is that interesting to
Oh, you need
me.
to come up here.
Yeah,
Our airspace is empty. Just come up here and fly around the Highlands. It's
I
fantastic.
have spent plenty of time flying around the
I
Highlands, of
bet you
course.
have.
Mostly with my hair on fire at 250 feet and 500 knots. But yeah, and that's part of the problem. I think it's kind of replicating some of what we used to do. It's not there, and I've just got amazing memories. I don't begrudge it at all. I loved my time and thoroughly enjoyed it.
I think that's the other thing, is having flown, an Airbus, going back to a Cessna 152 would be
Bit different.
a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody's
And
bringing you cups of tea and coffee for a start.
no, I know. I mean, how rude is that? I mean, I might, if it helps the local flying club out, I will do that, but it's not my goal.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. Oh, and as you've alluded to, and we haven't talked about it either, but you've got a very successful speaking career. You're out there, forging a new path, which more power to you. Fantastic. I'm really, yeah, really, really pleased to see that.
Thank you.
Um, there's two that I always ask. One of them, I don't know. We'll see. Most memorable event of your career, is it the same as your high point, or is it is there a different memorable event?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, obviously failing and then subsequently passing command was memorable. But I think actually the most memorable event is a really lovely thing, which is when we were filming inside the cockpit. I was operating a Keflavik, and there was a forecast suggesting the Northern Lights were going to be very strong that night. And I had asked the duty pilot if I would be allowed to have my big camera with me to capture it, because normally I would have just taken it, but I thought as I'm on TV, I better get permission. And so they had agreed. And halfway up to Keflavik, I realised that my battery was flat, and I thought, oh, that's just typical, isn't it? So I did a PA to the cabin when we left Keflavik, and I said, look, there is a chance that the Northern Lights are going to be on display as we leave. Because I've told you that they won't come out, but because my camera battery's gone flat, they probably will. And as we were leaving Keflavik, there was this little glimmer in the sky as we were climbing through about 20,000 feet. And it literally went from a tiny glimmer, it just went bang. And there was the aurora across the whole sky.
Wow.
And we told the cabin, and they dimmed the lights. And they said, you're going to have to do something, because otherwise everyone's going to be on the left-hand side of the aircraft. So we did an orbit. The airspace up there is quite empty, and air traffic control were quite happy for us to do an orbit so that everyone could see it. And it was just, I have seen amazing displays since, because I see them here all the time. And we did have an amazing display earlier this year, I think it was, which was to the south of us, very unusually. So that was an incredible overhead, but it was just the way it just went.
Wow.
It was
Yeah,
amazing.
what I thought you were going to say was you got the knock on the cockpit door, and about 15 camera batteries got delivered. But
No, there was a professional photographer sitting in the back, and she took photos of the wing with the lights behind it. And it came and spoke to me afterwards, and I gave her my email address, and she actually did email me the photos, which was
lovely.
amazing.
Yeah,
So,
nice. Yeah. And I mean, the last one, and you may be interested in your answer to this, because what you do is speaking and all the rest of it. But what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
Well, one of the I don't really find questions difficult, but one of the most interesting one was, can we trust Michael O'Leary? So I had just delivered a talk to Citywire, the financial publication institution, and the first question after my talk, which was nothing to do with, it was all to do with decision making and problem solving, was, can we trust Michael O'Leary? And I was like, yes, let's go with yes. But I haven't really been asked difficult questions, because if I can't answer something, I'll just say that's not my area of expertise, and if I can, I will. So and my background in that is that I was a fear of flying trainer for Easyjet, and so I learned very quickly how to answer questions in a way that don't make people terrified. So
Yeah.
one of the
Nice.
things you can't say to people who are scared of flying is, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that, because they'll only hear the pilot say, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So I can't think that I've had a difficult question, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, long may that
Easy
continue.
paper round, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. Long may that
I'll let
continue.
you know when I get a difficult question. I'll email it to you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that would be great. I should look forward to it. Yeah, Emma, thank you very, very much indeed. I wish you every success, ongoing success with book, speaking career, all the stuff you do, living up in the beautiful north of Scotland. I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been really lovely chatting to you, and likewise to you.
Yeah, take care. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye. I really hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Emma. I think she's just done so many amazing things, and such an inspirational figure with everything she's not only achieved but continues to achieve today. And I take my hat off to her really with the work that she's done, particularly on the charitable side. I think it was the most amazing enterprise, and richly rewarded with the MBE that she talks about. If you enjoyed it, then please share it, please push it around, do all the things that I normally ask you to do in terms of subscribing to YouTube, following whichever podcast platform you're on, liking it, reposting it, commenting on it, providing some feedback, all those kind of things that really help to get the visibility out there, because the more that you can help me do this, then the bigger and better the podcast becomes, and that's really, really important. So if you haven't done it already, then please do think about doing some subscription stuff, some supporting, some commenting, some resharing, because it just makes such a big difference. Wherever you're doing that, I'll be really grateful. If you're finding all these podcasts valuable, then if you can afford to do it, then please think about financially supporting the podcast. I mean, it makes such a difference to me. And I do the service essentially for free, but the support makes a very, very big difference. So if you're up for it, please go to patreon.com, either via the support the show link in your podcast platform, or going directly from the show notes on YouTube, and or just log straight into www.patreon.com/leading4life and join up. You can subscribe as a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. And doesn't cost you much money, but it makes a very, very big difference to what I do. And just think about it as a magazine subscription, or buy me a cup of coffee for Christmas and a mince pie. That'll be great. And if you're up for that, I'd be absolutely delighted. So thank you very, very much indeed for that, even considering it. Thank you for listening anyway, and I really, really hope you enjoy this. This will be the last episode that goes out before Christmas in 2025. So if you're listening just in advance of that, then I hope you have a fantastic holiday season with you and all your nearest and dearest. And I wish you everything that you wish yourselves for 2026 and beyond. Thank you ever so much for listening to what I put out here. Thanks. Bye-bye.